Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 10th of November. Today we're doing a frontline update looking at the situation on the Kherson, Orikhiv, Avdiivka, and Klishivka fronts. So we're going to start off with Kherson, where we're going to just go through really some of the events that started unfolding in the early days of November, but we're going to go through all of it and try to keep it concise. So on November 6th, Russian Telegram channel Romanov, they posted an image of a PTS-2 amphibious tracked transport vehicle that was spotted by a Russian drone as it made its way across the Dnieper River. This vehicle can carry about 10 tons of cargo or personnel, meaning that they could possibly transport lighter infantry fighting vehicles or armored personnel carriers across the river. But for now, the Ukrainians are only conducting transfers in very small quantities in order to test out whether this is a safe option, to determine whether this is beneficial to the Ukrainians, because there's the very high possibility that these vehicles could be spotted by the Russian forces and targeted not just on the river itself, but also once they land. So for now, these are just being done in very, very small quantities. But it does still show that the Ukrainians are gradually trying to build up their forces on the Krynky Bridgehead and in the wider area in the floodplains and forested areas around the village. Now, Russian source Rybar claims that over the past 2 weeks, the Ukrainians have expanded their presence in the village of Krynky from a couple dozen forces to a company-sized formation, which amounts to a total of around 300 men in the wider area. So not just within the village of Krynky, but also in the wider bridgehead itself. So that is a substantial increase in the number of forces. The Ukrainians are also moving in additional PTS vehicles from the rear, and they're moving their UAV control centers and electronic warfare stations closer to the front line, including on some of the Dnieper River islands. So for instance, the ones over here may have these systems being put in place, or for instance over here. And this is in order to give their drones more protection and allow them to conduct strikes even deeper into Russian territory. So right now, for instance, you have a lot of the strikes that are ongoing on the front line, but there's also some that are going on deeper on the rear, where you have some of the Russian logistics as they're trying to move in reinforcements into this area and conduct resupply. Over the past 2 weeks, the Ukrainian forces in Krynky have solidified control over the central part of the village, and they've also begun expanding control further westwards into these parts of the village in these blocks over here. At the same time, Rybar claims that the Ukrainians were able to advance a bit further south of Krynky and actually gain a foothold within the forested area located over here. But Rybar claims that any further Ukrainian advances by the 35th Marine Brigade in the direction of this highway over here, if we zoom out, this is a pretty important highway that connects Oleshki to really many other parts of the Kherson front. So it is important in terms of Russian logistics. But any sort of Ukrainian attempt, according to Rybar, was thwarted by a Russian ambush on the advancing Ukrainian forces. Now, there were several issues facing the Russian defenders on the Kherson front in particular that include a lack of electronic warfare systems to try to jam the Ukrainian drones, as we've seen a lot of videos of those Ukrainian drones, especially from Birds of Magyar, conducting strikes onto the Russian positions, as we discussed previously. There's also certain gaps within the air defense systems in this specific region, and there's a noted lack of counter-battery fire because you have the Ukrainian artillery stationed on some of the higher elevated areas in comparison just to the north of the northern bank of Kherson. So like basically a lot of the artillery stationed in these areas over here where I have these blue rectangles. So there is a noted lack of counter-battery fire, but at the same time, the Russian defenders do have an advantage in terms of firepower. So for instance, MLRS fire, also artillery fire, by the way, there was a very strong Russian artillery component, which includes several different artillery brigades and regiments located over here. You can find all the units on my map. Here's just one example of them. And there's also, of course, the Russian air power in this area. You have Fab 500, Fab 1500 strikes going on every single day, dozens of these strikes targeting Ukrainian positions on the southern bank of the river where they established a bridgehead, but also on staging points, supply lines on the northern bank of the river going on all across the Kherson front. Meanwhile, the Russians are moving in reinforcements to the Kherson sector. This could be for two reasons. It could be because of the increase in fighting in this region, and it could be because of the decrease in fighting on the wider southern front, including around Zaporozhye. When you look at the units that were moved in, So, for instance, you had the 171st Air Assault Battalion, which is a part of the 7th Air Assault Division that was moved into the Kherson front from the Operational Reserve. And then you have another example over here, the 177th Naval Infantry Regiment. It was previously stationed around the Polohi direction, which is a part of the Zaporozhye front. So it was trying to defend against the Ukrainian attacks during the counteroffensive. And now it's been moved to the Pischanivka area. And they've moved into an area where there's been reports over the past few days from Russian sources that the Ukrainians are trying to expand their ground operations. And in particular, there's this one video I have linked over here of the Russians shelling Ukrainian infantry as they were trying to advance along this specific road in the area just to the northwest of Pitstepnya. Now, the reason why they're trying to advance around this specific road is in order to get control of the road over here leading south, as this road would give the Ukrainians access to the entrances to several key villages on the front line, including Pitstepnya, Pischanivka, and Poima. And a big issue is the fact that the Ukrainians don't have access to many roads in this region, so they do want to try to get their hands on as many as they can. As right now, in terms of like moving their forces, they do have to rely, especially in this area in particular, on swampy marshland. Now, moving on to the Orikhiv sector, Ukrainian infantry from the 46th Air Assault Brigade, the 71st Jaeger Brigade, and the 15th National Guard Brigade have recently started increasing attacks on the front line, possibly due to the Russian movement of some reinforcements to the Kherson front. And a lot of the focus of the war focusing, or shifting at least, to the situation in Avdiivka. But these, I should warn you, are still relatively minor attacks. It's just a relative increase from what we saw over the past couple of weeks. So recent footage which emerged from early November shows a small group of about 6 Ukrainian infantrymen, and they were operating inside of Russia's anti-tank ditch, which is a part of the Russian Surovikin line. And in this video, you can see the Ukrainian infantry. They were hiding in dugouts that were built within the anti-tank ditch. And eventually they were spotted by the Russian drones. And then they were hit by some of these drones that were dropping munitions. And additionally, they were hit by Russian BMD-4Ms that were firing onto the Ukrainians. And eventually in this video, what you'll see is that the Ukrainians that survived, they got out of the road and they retreated back to their positions. The positions are located in some of the fields and tree lines located just north of the Surovikin line. So we can adjust the map to indicate that. So I'm not saying that they actually have a presence in the anti-tank ditch anymore. It is possible that the situation is fluid because it seems like right now this part of the anti-tank ditch is no man's land. But either way, it does indicate that there was a small increase in the fighting over here, and that there was also a minor advance reported by the Ukrainians, really amounting to about 800 meters. There was also an increase in the clashes to the north of Verbove, where there were positional fights reported. In this region, the Russians tried to get control over some of the open fields located in this blue area over here. Once they landed, they were targeted by Ukrainian DPICMs and artillery fire. And eventually that Russian attack was repelled. And then the Ukrainians, they were able to take those positions for themselves that were previously in no man's land. So really in this specific area, you saw an advance of about 700, 800 meters. So again, I want to just say this is nothing significant for now. It's just a very minor positional advance. Now moving on to Avdiivka, starting off on the southern flank, there's not much to report in terms of changes to the front line. Of course, there still is very heavy fighting. There is a substantial decrease in the amount of armored assaults, but there are still infantry attacks, some of which did lead to gains, including some gains just to the northeast of the quarry over here that was taken over by Russian and DPR forces. But again, this is a relatively minor advance. The reason why is because the area into which the Russians are now advancing, which is just to the west and to the southwest of Avdiivka, so basically in these areas over here, is extremely fortified. It's some of the really the most fortified areas in the entire Avdiivka front, especially this abandoned military base, which is now being used as a defense area for the Ukrainians, where they also have tunnel systems. And there's also all these trench systems that have been built up on the southern flank of Avdiivka, specifically around here, around this road where I have this yellow line marked, which leads into the Chimik industrial, or not industrial, but residential district in the southwestern part of Avdiivka. So that's part of the rationale for why there's been a slowing down in the advances around here. Now moving on to Avdiivka's northern flank, over the past week or even farther than that, really throughout the entire month of November, you had a Russian infantry with support from tanks and BMD-4s continue to solidify control over Ukrainian trenches in the fields to the west of Krasnohorivka. So that's something that we already knew. And then the newer development is that the Russian infantry was able to reach the rail line itself and the two windbreaks that are adjacent to it. So then here you can see this video I've linked on my map of Russian APC or IFV gun firing into Ukrainian positions near the Krasnohorivka rail line. This was at a point where they were trying to clear out the Ukrainian positions around here before the Russians were able to eventually overrun them. So they're now trying to establish positions over here that could be permanent, but the situation is still difficult in this area as there are many Ukrainian counterattacks, so there is a back and forth going on. So I wouldn't say that it is completely a safe position, of course, given the fact that it is literally at ground zero of the front line. But the Russians were able to also advance further north. They were able to advance through this area over here where there were some plantations in a rural dacha area. So there was a noted advance in the fields that are to the northeast of the rail line located over here. At the same time, the Ukrainians are targeting the Russian forces that are reaching this area with their own artillery and also with drones. So for instance, here you have the Alcor drone unit dropping munitions on a trench that was built by the Ukrainians and was taken over by the Russians, which runs along this road over here. And the Alcor drone unit is a drone unit attached to the 116th Territorial Defense Brigade, which is operating on this part of the front line. And then further south, we have this video, which may be old, but it does show this Ukrainian Bradley firing at Russian forces located within these two tree lines, which shows how Bradleys from the 47th Mechanized Brigade are involved in trying to provide fire support for the Ukrainians and trying to suppress the Russian positions themselves. Now, moving into the future, although there are heavy clashes that are ongoing in the eastern outskirts of the village of Stepove, there is very fierce Ukrainian resistance located in this area. But I do think based on the front lines right now that there is an opportunity for Russia to attack to the northwest. So we're going to have to see if they actually go for that. Of course, there is very fierce Ukrainian resistance in this area as well as they moved in many reinforcements as we talked about in previous videos. We just talked about the 47th, but there's also additional elements that are coming in from other parts of the front line, from the Velika Novosilka axis, for instance. And just looking at the elevation map, I think it gives us a very good idea of what would be necessary in order for the Russians to continue their advances and to threaten Ukrainian supply lines. So here you have this village. It is a very important Ukrainian supply hub. It's called Ocheretine, and it is really an area that completely dominates the surrounding valleys. It's located on this ridge, and this is also where the rail line runs through. The entire rail line in this region, which I'll mark in yellow for you guys, it is located on higher elevation compared to the surrounding areas, which is a big part of why the Ukrainians are defending tooth and nail to prevent further Russian advances, not just on the rail line located over here, but also on the rail line located to the north of Krasnohorivka, where you have the Ukrainians trying to hold back Russian forces, and so far they've been successful for the most part at holding back Russian attacks around Novokalinove and Keramik. And the reason why is because this gives the Ukrainians an elevation advantage, overlooking Russian positions within Krasnohorivka and in supply lines leading into Krasnohorivka. So that would be around here and around here, for instance. But this is also on the flip side a reason why the Russians would want to try to overrun these positions, not just to eliminate the Ukrainian firing points, but also to take them for themselves, for instance. So while the Russian forces have already advanced in a small capacity through open fields and through parts of the rail line that are located in a higher elevation in the northwestern direction towards villages such as Novobakhmutivka and Ocheretine, the Ukrainians do still hold most of the dominant heights in this region. And what it would mean for Russia to take over these regions is pretty significant, because I'm not saying that they would have to even take over the villages themselves, but just advancing in that direction through these heights would give, first of all, the Russians an opportunity to flank Berdichi and Stepove from the north, where you do have a lot of Ukrainian resistance and where you do have a lot of supply lines leading in from Ocheretine deeper into the entire Ukrainian supply system and then into Avdiivka itself. So these are very important areas for Ukraine to hold on to, including the northern flank, but also just by taking over Ocheretine, or just the entire area around it, the Russian forces would have a very good position overlooking the entire supply system coming in from the west to the east, leading into Avdiivka. So if you look over here, there's just a very this very low area, just many valleys, which include places like Orlivka and a lot of these other villages that are supply hubs into Avdiivka. And by getting control of these areas, the Russian forces would be able to set up firing positions that could target the Ukrainians as they move in reinforcements and resupply, or even potentially try to withdraw forces throughout the course of the battle. So this would be one of the best ways for the Russians to ensure further advances in a way that would try to diminish losses compared to what they've experienced in the initial months of the attack. And this is also something that I think the Ukrainians should keep in mind when they try to conduct their defensive operations in this area. And I would also keep an eye out for what's going on around Keramik and Novokalinove, whether the Ukrainians try to counterattack around there or whether the Russians preemptively try to go on the attack in these regions to try to prevent the Ukrainians from putting pressure onto the northern flank of Avdiivka around the area of Krasnohorivka. Recently, a slew of videos have come out confirming that the Russian positions have advanced, the Russian forces have advanced around Klishivka, including around the rail line to the east and to the north of the village. And I'm going to go through all those videos for you guys now, which do show the Ukrainian forces targeting the Russian infantry in those regions. So for instance, here you have the 24th IDAR Battalion using 122 millimeter mortars and drone drop munitions to hit Russian infantry near a rail line that's located over here, which shows a relatively minor Russian advance in the region. Here we have the 5th Assault Brigade. They dropped drones onto Russian positions. These were previously Ukrainian-controlled areas within this forested line. This forested line was previously under Ukrainian control, and there were also trenches set up in the region, which made it a very strong Ukrainian forward position. But apparently, at some point, the Russians were able to push them back, and now the Ukrainians are filming themselves attacking and actually causing some casualties for the Russian forces that are stationed in the area at the moment. Then looking a bit to the south, the Russians have been able to get control of this strip of land, this part of the rail line, and the two parallel windbreaks. So here you have a video from the 22nd Brigade where they shell the Russian forces during the nighttime near the rail line. And then here you have another video from the SBU Unit A where they hit Russian positions at a similar part of the front line. So again, for now, it's just positional changes. The Russian advance, I guess if you want to highlight the areas that were taken that I just discussed in this video, it would be these areas over here. So for now, it is still a relatively minor advance. We're going to have to see if this just is a way for Russia to improve their forward positions as they're trying to conduct an active defense in this area going into the mud season and then going into the winter months, or if it is a wider offensive operation aimed at gaining more favorable positions deeper into the Klishivka area. That's something that I can't speak to yet as we don't have enough information from this area. The only information we have is from those 4 videos I showed. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.